Hello, my name is Kristian Fischer. I'm the director at DIIS, the Danish Institute for International Studies. And I would like to say that we are delighted to have this event with the German Defense Minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who is not only Defense Minister, but also the chairperson of the CDU in Germany. It's great to have you with us today, Minister, for this conversation on security in Europe, including transatlantic relations. And the timing is absolutely perfect. You just took over the EU presidency a few days ago for the rest of 2020. You had planned, Minister, to visit the Nordic countries this spring, but due to the coronavirus, it had to be done by cyberspace. And I must say that I'm really pleased to see that you have decided also to do this round with civil society organizations like DIIS. We are very happy about this. It's a strong signal to that you want to engage with the broader public in our countries. I would also like to say a warm welcome to the many people, not only from Denmark and from Germany, who are following this event, but we know we also have people from other countries. Warm welcome to you. We have altogether 1 hour for the event, and we want it to be a 4-stage rocket, to use a defense metaphor. First, we'll listen to the minister, and then I will start a conversation with the minister as a second stage of the rocket. Then Mikkel Runge Olesen, who is a senior researcher here at DIIS, will join in, and finally, senior researcher also at DIIS, Felicia Stockholm-Banke, will join in also, where the focus is going to be on EU and CSDP issues. But without further ado, Minister, the floor is yours.
Kristian Fischer, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome everybody who has tuned in. Welcome to this event today. Thank you very much to the Danish Institute for International Studies. Because of this event, I can engage with many people and talk about security and defense policy. I'm looking forward to that. In my brief introduction, I would like to say a few words about our priorities in defense and security policy in the framework of the EU Council Presidency. As you may be aware, the COVID-19 situation has changed our plans for the Council Presidency quite considerably, and so therefore we are focusing more on financial and economic issues now. We will be thinking about the recovery fund and the multi-annual financial framework, but COVID-19 also showed us that Europe is more vulnerable, and in a different sense vulnerable, than we have always imagined, and now we have to draw lessons learned from that. And so that's why we will focus in our Council Presidency in security and defense policy on especially the following topics: resilience and the ability to act of Europe. We will also focus on a second topic, which is the cooperation between the EU and NATO, because we would like to link these two organizations closer to one another. We do not only want to have a theoretical discussion here, no, we want to implement concrete projects. What does that mean in the framework of the financial negotiations? Well, here we want to make sure that when it comes to military mobility, we make progress. We have a joint working group between the EU and NATO on that topic. We want to look into the question as to how we can promote and further the PESCO projects, especially the still open and debated question of third state participation. That's an issue we want to clarify. And also we want to discuss further steps for a common strategic compass for Europe. The first step is to be taken over the next few months. It would be setting up a common threat analysis, because only if we agree and are on the same page about the threat situation will we be able to draw the right strategic conclusions from that. And then we also want to help shape the, if I can call it that, the post-COVID-19 order. We have seen how COVID-19 has changed the world order. We perceive international conflicts. We see and observe that there is a power shift going on in the world right now, and we are firmly convinced that Europe, that the European countries can and have to work together here, so that the ideas that link us to one another, our common ideas and values, still persist in a changing world order, and that these values are still valid and that they gain influence. Of course, we also want to continue our bilateral cooperation with Denmark. In many areas, we have good cooperation, especially these days. We identified a common world cultural heritage between our two countries within UNESCO, which is how to treat migrants. When it comes to security and defense policy, we deployed to many common missions and operations. We together support the eastern flank in Estland, in Estonia. We are committed together in MINUSMA in Mali. Our service members stand side by side in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And we also cooperate closely in armaments policy. And on top of that, we also share a common view of the international order that is based on rules-based international treaties on values, on human rights and democracy, etc. And in July, as part of our EU Council Presidency, we also have the chairmanship in the UN Security Council. Next week, we will hold a session that I will be chairing. And in this session, we will focus on human rights in the peacekeeping missions. This is the first time in a long time that the UN Security Council will talk about human rights again. And I think this is very necessary to do that. And I know that with Denmark, we pursue the same interests here. And so we have and share a large common basis, and I'm looking forward to discuss with you on the foundation of this basis and to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for leading us off in this excellent way. I noted that you mentioned the term shared interest and shared values a few times in your introductory remarks, and it's also something that we see, of course, when we talk about NATO. Quite often we say NATO is based on common transatlantic interest and values. And also we see it in your EU presidency program. And I would like to zoom in a little bit here and ask you, because we've seen in the last few years, we've seen some more difficult issues when it comes to the transatlantic dimension. And I wanted to have a chat with you here on whether you see that there is more space and increasing differences, if you've seen that in the last few years between the EU and many European allies when it comes to shared values. We've seen a number of developments over the last few years, and quite often we, at least in this country, we often tend to see that there is an uncertainty about whether those shared values are as strong as they used to be.
Thank you very much for this very interesting question. Indeed, in recent years, we have seen more and more that there are differences between common interests that we represent and that we share with others. And it's especially the three major crises that we've seen in recent years in Europe and that we have gone through, which is the economic and financial crisis, the migration crisis, and now this health crisis with COVID-19. These three crises have shown that there are different interests in the sense of a different perception of threats and urgency to act, especially when it comes to the migration issue. And then deriving from that, another issue arises the question, how can we implement these values into political measures? And this question has been debated a lot. This has become clear in the financial and economic crisis, when we had to tackle the issue of how do we deal with a financial solidity in different budgets. And in the migration crisis, this has become very apparent with the question, how do we protect our external borders? How do we deal with asylum legislation in the European Union? And how do we deal with that together? And so the major challenge that arises from that, I think, is that with a view to these frictions or these minor cracks in our community, that these frictions can make us lose our cohesion that we have, and that could potentially lead to the fact that in an international situation, we are no longer capable of speaking with one voice as the EU, and that our individual voices will no longer be that strong. I also perceive the COVID-19 situation as an opportunity, however, because on the one hand, it is a threat that each and every country in the EU was hit by equally. None of the countries is to blame. No, it's a worldwide pandemic. It posed the same threat to all of us. And so in this field, we have seen that this pandemic led us to the limits of our national ability to act, to a point where we realized, well, it would have been good if Europe, right from the outset, had been able to act. We were not able to act right from the start, and others exploited that. And so from my point of view, this is a crossroads where we're at right now, but COVID-19 gives us the chance to get closer together once again.
Thank you for that. One aspect when we, if we zoom in on the transatlantic relations, is of course the way that we see the tone in the debate. We see Germany being recently termed as a delinquent in contributions to NATO. That was said by the President of the United States. We also see some signs where we see not as early and as proper consultations across the Atlantic. I need to just mention Iraq and Syria as examples. And when you look at this, how do you see this? Do we see a less predictable US for Germany and for allies? And do we have to get used to a transatlantic relationship which is far more based on individual national interest and less on these shared interests and values?
Quite surely we have common values that we share with the United States of America. And despite all the very justified discussions that are going on right now with regards to how we behave to one another and about the tone of a conversation, we must never forget that in our transatlantic friendship, there is much more at the core than a current administration. It's instead values that have been linking us for a long time. It's standing up for our security together. This is something that has carried us throughout the past several years. I would like to remind you that NATO just invoked Article 5 only once, and that happened after 9/11, when we joined our American friends, stood side by side with them and joined them in going to Afghanistan to fight terrorism there. And so all states, especially the United States, have claimed losses in Afghanistan. Lives were lost, people were injured, and so this shows that we are still close with the US. However, we must make a distinction, in fact, with regard to one question. In recent years, decisions were made and consultations were maybe not sufficient, and I think in all frankness, I can say today that we would have desired more close cooperation or consultation, for example, with regard to the latest decisions for Syria. These decisions by the US have led to changes in the region. That's why I want to reiterate, when it comes to the intended troop reduction of US troops in Germany, I can say that this is not a bilateral question between Germany and the United States. No, instead, it's a question that concerns other countries as well, especially when it comes to where the US forces will deploy to after they leave Germany. And another aspect is important here as well, and that's the strategic discussion that we have to engage in. Are there other regions in the world, for example, the Indo-Pacific Ocean, that are of strategic importance as well, or can be in the future? And how will the burdens be shared then? The burdens that arise within NATO, within Europe, but also in these other regions. And how will this burden sharing be redistributed? And the burden sharing debate makes it necessary for us as Europeans who are NATO members to develop our own capabilities and to be able to act, especially in regions that in a very special way are of concern to our own security interests. Examples for that are countries in the African continent, for example, the Sahel region. We need to be better prepared for these types of regions than has been the case until now.
Thank you for the answer. I know Mikkel Runge is going to be following up on the issue of the troop reductions in Germany, but let me zoom in a bit on Russia. And it's clear that we've seen some strained relations in the last few years after the events in Georgia and now also in Ukraine, and that has led to some very substantial initiative from NATO. You're leading the NATO mission in the enhanced forward presence mission in Lithuania, for example, and you mentioned that in your initial remarks. When you look at the situation we have with the Russians, of course we need a deterrent component, but we also need a dialogue component. And we've not seen much progress on the dialogue component in recent years. Can you open the curtain a bit to us on where you may see that there will be some opportunities, for example, by using the COVID-19 crisis or other events to establish some sort of a dialogue with Russia, also on security matters?
I'm very grateful that you're picking up on these two components that make up our relationship with Russia. It's a tradition of German foreign policy too. We just talked about interests and values. Russia is a wonderful country with wonderful people. It's a big neighbor to Germany, and it is in our interest, or in the interest of a peaceful order, that we achieve a good basis for coexistence. And let me be more concrete. We should, on the one hand, ask ourselves what our common interests are. And there are certain global issues where we know that we can only solve them together. This is certainly true when it comes to climate change. No country on its own, no continent on its own can pull back from that. We can only do it together because the impact of climate change will affect us all, no matter whether it's in Russia or in any other country. We see at the moment COVID-19 is just a representative of pandemics and maybe future diseases, and we know we will only have good protection if we have a vaccine and if we can ensure that people have access to these vaccines. I think this is a topic that is not suitable for systemic competition. I think it's a topic where everyone in the international community have to work together. On the other hand, we have to see that there are different values when it comes to the systems. So we have a competition between systems, and we need to see that there are certain points where we are in disagreement, and this disagreement has to be clearly talked about, especially when it comes to preserving own interests, or when it comes to preserving interests when borders are moved by force, as happened in Ukraine. And so when assuming perceived own interests, that may be affected by neighboring countries. So as we saw in Georgia, well, that is something where we as a value community have to point towards that. And we have to, as we did in Ukraine, create clear sanctions too.
Thanks for that. In your initial remarks, you also mentioned the relations with Denmark. And let me use this opportunity also to ask you about what your political ambition is when it comes to the further development of the relations on the defense dimensions with Denmark. And add a little question to that, and that is, when you look at Danish defense, what is it, apart from what you mentioned, that we share common values and norms and so forth, what is it that you're looking for when you look at Danish defense cooperation? It could be many things. It could be the naval, it could be for international operations, it could be many different things. But what is it that may be appealing for Germany as a big state to be increasing cooperation with Denmark?
The cooperation, and I just mentioned it earlier. So we have a certain framework for that, and it's a very good cooperation. We work very closely together in different operations and missions. I think the areas of cooperation in the future could be when it comes to the high north. There are certain strategic interests of the Northern European states that are also interests of Germany. There's the question of strategic areas, so the free access, the free connection between Northern America and Canada with the European continent. There's the question of the Barents Sea and other maritime regions, and with the view to climate change, there will also be the question of how and on what basis we approach the Arctic region. Will it be a conflict region, or can we achieve in an internationally ordered way to use this region in a positive way so that it contributes to solving problems of humanity and is available to all of humanity, and that we can avoid conflict there? This shows that we have a particular interest when it comes to cooperating in the maritime domain, also with a view to the expertise that Denmark has. I see options there to intensify cooperation. There are some land systems that we're working together on, and now if we develop the new main ground combat system, then this is a development of our defense. And at the end, we need to also discuss who could take part in cooperation on that. One final point that I'd like to mention, and that is the question of the international order. I believe that when we think about the role of the United Nations and the rule and the international organizations, how rules-based should the world be? Do we need to pay attention to human rights? I think we have great agreement on that, and Denmark is an important partner for Germany in that sense too, not only working together in the European area, but also when it comes to thinking about who is an advocate of a value-based, rules-based international order as represented by the United Nations, who is advocating for these goals. And I think Denmark is an important country in that respect too.
Thank you. And now we hand over to Mikkel Runge Olesen. Mikkel, would you join in, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer. Thank you for being with us. I would like to return a bit to the question of U.S. troop reductions in Germany, and I'd like to ask. U.S. President Donald Trump has tied together the question of troop reductions to low German defense expenditures. Now, German defense expenditures have been going up in recent years, but I would like to ask whether these remarks from Donald Trump will have any effect on German decisions regarding defense expenditures. Also, I would like to add a more general question as to how these remarks from Donald Trump regarding troop reductions, how have they been received in Germany in general? Thank you.
To start with your second question, well, the Germans were very calm about this because the tone of voice was not new. It's something that we have known from recent years, and we know that the US is preparing for elections, and election time is always a special time. So this didn't cause much of a stir here. But what is crucial now is that we show that the question about Germany having to invest more in defense is first of all a question of our very own interest. It's in our very own interest to do that. And the burden sharing question is a question that was asked long before President Trump. Even George W. Bush brought up this question. President Obama discussed it. So now, as our economy is shrinking as a result of COVID-19, we will probably reach 2% quicker than expected. But this mechanism makes it clear that it's not about figures alone. It's about what we have pledged in terms of military capabilities, and what we pledged is that by 2030 we would provide 10% of NATO's military capabilities in the Bundeswehr, and that is the basis that we're working on, and that is why we need growing defense budgets in order to have better capabilities, better equipment, more service personnel, better equipped personnel, make that available to NATO, because NATO is an alliance of solidarity. And if we take on 10%, then everyone else will contribute 90% that we will benefit from too. So this is a debate in Germany that doesn't have anything to do with the most recent events in the US.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, for my second question, I'd like to stay with NATO, but shift a bit in geography, so to speak. At the NATO summit in London in December, China was on the table for the first time in the alliance history. You have yourself recently spoken about China as I believe you called it a systemic challenge for the US and the EU. At the same time, however, for example, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell, recently adopted a relatively reassuring interpretation of China as a systemic rival. And he did this in the aftermath of the latest strategic dialogue meeting between the EU and China. And he stressed, for example, that China, in his view, is not a threat to world peace, nor has ambitions to use force and participate in military conflicts. And that leads me to ask, what is the German take on the rise of China as a systemic rival? And what role do you potentially see for NATO, if any, in dealing with China?
China
is for us in Germany and in the EU, in fact, on the one hand, a country that we cooperate very closely economically, and at the same time, it's also a competitor in terms of the economy. At the same time, it is not an opponent or an enemy. China is a very relevant part of the world. I said earlier, with a view to global issues that we all need to face, like climate change, we can only find a solution if we also include countries like China. Therefore, it is necessary that we cooperate well with China. But here, too, we need to address problems openly. So there is a systemic competition because China is a very different political system. China has a very different perspective of the values that we share here with a view to individualism, human rights, democratic values. And so in that sense, we are in a competition with China internationally, and I think it's worthwhile to step up for our system, our values. We also see that we understand multilateralism differently than the Chinese do. Multilateralism for us is, in fact, consisting of negotiated treaties, the use of international organizations in order to find solutions, reach compromise that finds the support of everybody. Multilateralism, as I've been experiencing it during the COVID crisis, for China is rather a large number of bilateral relations where China is trying to implement its own interests. This is a very different approach than the approach we pursue here in Europe. And that leads me to the point where we need to ask ourselves in Europe, if we believe that our system, our idea, our values, our idea of multilateralism are worth standing up for internationally, then we need to know that this will only work and our voice will only be heard if we act together at European level. Because otherwise, if we try that as nation states individually, we run the risk of getting lost in the competition and losing ground in the competition between the US and China. Our values and our system are both so good that it's worth stepping up for that in the future.
And sorry, just did you see a role for NATO in all of that?
Yes, I do also see a role for NATO in that. It is important that within NATO, we do not perceive China and classify or categorize China as an opponent, but still we see concerns of like-minded states like Australia or Japan or Korea and other countries in the Indo-Pacific Ocean with a view to their own interests, with a view to our values, the freedom of navigation, etc. We also know that these countries wish for an institution like NATO that stands up for these values, that these countries get into closer cooperation with NATO. At the same time, we also see and are aware of the systemic challenges and of the developments of new systems. One question that arises is, what will space hold for us in the future? What will China do in the space domain? And this is why NATO will also look into China, but not in a sense of looking at China as an enemy of NATO member states.
Thank you very much, Mikkel. I think this is a perfect bridge over to the EU and the EU presidency program and CSDP. And here we hand over to a senior researcher from DIIS, Cecilie Banke. Cecilie, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. And also thank you, Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer, for meeting us this way. This is extremely interesting. And also may I congratulate you on the on the EU presidency. I would like to bring you back a little bit to something you said in the beginning in your introduction. You mentioned the lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis for security and defense policy. And that made me a little curious actually, because what are the lessons learned from COVID-19 when we think about European defense and security policy? If we may start there, Minister, thank you.
The COVID-19 situation showed us that this crisis does not only have an impact on our health sector in our countries, but it showed us that it had an impact on the operational readiness of our armed forces, it had an impact on our readiness on deployment, on our missions. And so a pandemic is in that sense something that challenges the readiness and defensive capabilities of the armed forces. And in that sense, a pandemic also poses a threat to us as part of a broader threat analysis. In the beginning of the pandemic, when we in Europe were not able to show European solidarity and respond together to the pandemic, for example, by transporting and exchanging material and equipment because we all had too little of the equipment we needed. At that point, we saw in the beginning that there was an area in the EU that this nation states considered to be their own responsibility, and rightly so. But now, where there is a need, we decided that we need a EU structure for that. And it is important that we do not build structures that copy NATO. In NATO, we have good structures that are well rehearsed. We have the SOLAS system within NATO. We can transport material and equipment through SOLAS with the NATO aircraft. And so it's important that NATO is not the first responder in a crisis like that, but no, the first responders are the nation states and the EU. And we need to build up capabilities here. And my last point on that is this: in the course of the debate on European solidarity, all armed forces in Europe played a very positive role. It was the armed forces that started building up the first contacts and establishing first contacts. In Germany, it was the Bundeswehr, our armed forces, that took in intensive care patients from other European countries and brought them to Germany so that they could get intensive care in Germany and ventilation when in other countries the capacities had reached their limit. And so this positive impulse, that's something that we would like to take up and take with us and turn that into a concrete PESCO project in our EU Council Presidency. That way we could link up the different medical units of our European armed forces so that they can cooperate better. We want to do common stockpiling, build a joint medical command so that we have good cooperation in the medical field of the armed forces so that we have everything available we need in case of a next pandemic, especially if civilian systems get to the limit.
So where are we in this process in building up our own capabilities? You mentioned it just earlier on during our conversation. I think you said something with the question to Mikkel and also to Kristian, and also the EU High Representative Josep Borrell. He recently stated that if we need to survive in this troubled world, the EU needs to have its own capacities. So where are we in this process, and how would Germany, the German presidency, take that? Where will you bring it? Would you like to bring it? Are we actually moving towards European strategic autonomy?
On your first question, in recent years, we have launched many individual initiatives and structural initiatives and elements, and we established those. And you mentioned some of them. It's the European Defense Fund, for example, the PESCO projects that we launched. We discussed the question of the European Peace Facility. the European battle groups exist. So there are so many different elements, but what we lack is a joint strategic compass. We all come from very different national armed forces. We all have our own traditions, our own operational understanding. We have our own chains of command, and the Bundeswehr, our armed forces, are a typical parliamentary army. Every mission, every deployment has to go through parliament, be approved by parliament. This is very different in France, for example. And that leads to different questions. And so when it comes to how quick can decisions be made in the different countries, that's a question you can't really get one answer from all the countries. And so we have to get somehow to a common strategic compass in a security and defense policy. And that's our goal. And the first decisive step towards that is to be taken in the next few months during the Council Presidency. And that is having a shared understanding of the threat situation. We addressed Russia and China briefly earlier. Of course, the threat perception in the Northern European states, in the Baltic states, in the Eastern European states, vis-a-vis Russia is very different than the threat perception here in France, in Spain, or Italy. But we do need a common understanding of that, because only once we have that can we derive strategic conclusions from that. And then the next step would be to develop a common understanding for the question, how do we deploy? What is our operational view and perspective on our deployment? And so that's why I believe that this is grassroots work that we're doing right now within the EU and also within the trio presidency between Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia.
Right. Would that also, when you say that we need a common strategic compass, would there also soon be a new global strategy? There was one developed in 2016, introduced. Is it time to have a new global strategy for the EU?
I think what we really need to do if we want to develop a common strategic compass for security and defense policy is this. First of all, we should see whether or not it is compatible with the EU global strategy of 2016, or whether adaptations need to be made. But if you look at what has happened in the world and what has changed in the world since 2016, all the things we've gone through and learned, let me just mention the refugee crisis, or the climate crisis, or the COVID-19 crisis, or even a topic that we addressed earlier, which was potentially different views of multilateralism, or a competition of systems between the United States and China. And if we look at all of these things, a global compass, a strategic compass of the EU, or a global strategy wouldn't never be a document that is not a living document. It needs to be a living document. It needs to be amended and developed further, always in light and against the backdrop of what's happening in the world.
Kristian, do I have time for one more question? Because one of your priorities in your presidency is the role of the European Union in the world. Could you tell us a little bit about the ideas behind this? What are you thinking about? What kind of role for Europe or for the European Union in the world? What is behind this?
I would like to start off with one topic that apparently has nothing to do with security and defense policy. We have a collection of very different countries. If you look at the EU as a whole, we are a highly developed, highly industrialized region. We are one of the most prosperous regions in the world. We are one of the regions that has the highest consumption in various goods internationally. And when it comes to how to deal with global climate change, I have to say that this is a special challenge for us. And now let's look at the Green Deal. It was announced at the EU level, and if we manage to make it clear and demonstrate clearly that also for the future you need to find a way of living and doing business that also includes climate change, that is climate friendly and climate neutral, that takes into account the development of new technologies. let me mention hydrogen, clean hydrogen technology, and that could be an energy source for the future. So if we can develop something like that, a policy that includes all of that, showing that we can not only save the climate, but at the same time be economically successful and generate prosperity for our population, then we can act as a role model for other regions in the world. And I think we're so strong that this brings about a responsibility for us that we bear. With that strength comes a responsibility, and we should work ambitiously on implementing these goals. That means currently that we must not adopt an attitude of saying, well, yes, we have the COVID-19 challenge right now, and we now face a challenge in dealing with the economic impact of COVID-19. And this is why right now we don't really have the time to look into climate change, for example, or to look into, keeping security, maintaining security. No, we live in a time of simultaneity, and this is a time that is very challenging, but I believe that the EU and the EU member states are strong enough to tackle that simultaneity. And if we can do it, then this is an important, substantial contribution to the world tackling all these issues.
Right. Thank you. Do I have more time, Kristian?
No, you have more time, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Minister. Thank you.
I have one question for you, Minister. I know that Mikkel is also dying for having another question. My question is related to your speech at the Munich Security Conference, where I noted that you spoke about artificial intelligence. And that we as Europeans need to be far more aware of those demands and challenges that face us in this regard. And my question would be whether there is a need to have a far closer transatlantic dialogue on China's investment in artificial intelligence. I noted that Joseph Borrell, he proposed to have this strategic dialogue on China, and I understand also that there's been a positive response from the Trump administration on that. But would one of the key issues in that dialogue also be artificial intelligence?
I would very much support that. I would support artificial intelligence playing a role in that dialogue. I think it's about 2 points. First of all, big task for us in Europe, that when it comes to research and development of artificial intelligence, that we work closely together in a way that our national efforts can be pooled, so that we have a better output or more visible, globally visible output, because we compete with someone who is spending a lot of money both in China and in the United States. They use a lot of funds, and we will only be able to persevere if we pool our own resources. But artificial intelligence and all that's associated with that, self-learning systems, increasingly autonomous systems, that's also connected to security. And here, as in other areas of armament and equipment, I believe there's a question here whether we can find common and international rules when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence in the weapon systems of the future. So limiting or arms control, disarmament, that does not only apply to the nuclear or the conventional domain, but it also applies to the weapon systems of the future. And they are systems that will, to a large extent, be controlled by artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much. Mikkel, would you, I know you're dying.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Minister. I just want to return then to NATO once more, but focus a little bit more on the European pillar. Now, French President Macron recently warned that we are currently experiencing the brain death of NATO, talking about the lack of common strategic decision-making in NATO. What's your position on the status of NATO, and in particular on the status of its European pillar? And what can be done to increase NATO defense cooperation going forward? Thanks.
There are certainly many points that we must discuss in NATO and discuss critically. I've been in office for 1 year and I've not seen NATO as brain dead at all. There are debates about many questions. It's really an area of debate and they are able to act. And so when we think about the future direction of NATO, then that is something that needs to be continuously reviewed and adapted. And I think that is something that must take place. And that's why it's good that we've started the reflection process and we are expecting the first results from that by the end of the year. And on that basis can have an additional debate and take decisions based on that. Something that we need to see more in future in NATO, the European pillar, we might arrive at a strategic situation where the question of interests that we have in NATO will be different. If we look at different regions, such as Africa, for example, like the Sahel region, we can see even today that the Sahel region is important for the security in Europe when it comes to export of terrorism, when we think about migration flows. So Africa plays a different role for Europe in terms of geography and in other aspects. And it's much more urgent for Europe than for the United States, for example. Still, we're engaged together in this area at the moment. And we cannot rule out that there will be situations where the United States will be thinking about whether it wants to continue its engagement in that region as it is now. And that is why we Europeans need to be able, in such a region on our own, with less support from the United States, that we can act there. In Iraq, for example, we currently have the discussion whether certain training components that we contributed as part of the international coalition, whether those training components could be transferred to a NATO mission. Also against the background that in many regions there are different assessments, maybe also a different appreciation of NATO as a European American alliance. Maybe that is appreciated in a different way than just an American mission. So those are issues that we will have to discuss. And I think we cannot rule out that in future there will be NATO missions where we will have more equal burden sharing between the European pillar and the American pillar. We will have NATO missions where we may have a higher burden on the US side, and there will be regions where the burden will be higher on the European Union. And that is a change, and a change that we need to adapt to. We need more European ability to act for such a situation.
Thank you. Cecilia, did you have a last question?
It was actually, it's partly already being answered by Minister, but it was something about, Minister, you, again, in your introduction, you said that Europe is more vulnerable now. And this vulnerability is focus of your presidency. And then you said we need resilience and ability to act of Europe. And of course, I have to ask this question, how act? You already partly answered by this example you just mentioned, but maybe you could expand a little bit. How act? How act for Europe, to Europe? What were you thinking about?
Indeed, COVID-19 has given us a different threat perception. If someone in January had told you that the question whether you have face masks or surgical masks or not, or whether you have certain substances to produce a medical drug, that such questions would be systemic questions, I think we would have answered that with no. But COVID-19 has shown us that the way that we are currently interlinked internationally has led to a situation where I think we must reconsider now where we can become maybe a bit more autonomous, not in terms of national isolation, but in terms of being able in such situations to act. And that means that we need to think about, when it comes to disaster prevention, crisis prevention, how we work beyond the nation states and think about what structures we're working in. For example, do we do common stockpiling so that out of European solidarity we can provide support? So those are questions that we need to address again. And the other challenge that we're faced with, those are the very big questions of the future. I mentioned space earlier. Space as a domain that should be available to all of humanity, where there are very strong economic interests, but of course it's also about security, about armament. And we see here that with a view to the other players in the world, we can only ensure our interests if we do that together as Europeans. So those are future areas where it makes no sense that everyone acts only nationally, but that we pool our forces and bundle our forces. And another point would certainly be the decision-making process, the procedures within the European Union. We are a very large union with many different points of view, with very individual states, and we have certain decision-making processes, for example, the unanimity rule, where it takes very long sometimes to be able to act. And that's why we have a discussion within the EU, even now, whether maybe we can use different voting arrangements. So the question about the internal structure of the European Union, that will also be one that we have to work on. It is still not completely resolved, even though due to the current efforts, it's moved to the background a little bit now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer. This has been very, very good. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your answers and for your reflections, not the least. This has been most useful, and I'm sure that this has been food for thought, not only for the upcoming lunch, but also for the summer. Thank you for those reflections. We wish you all the best in your EU presidency. We know that many challenges lie ahead of the EU member states, and it's a big task that you have, but we're sure that you're going to do well. Let me also say that you are always most welcome to visit our institute if you come in real life to Copenhagen. I would also like to say hello to the audience for participating. It has been very good to have you with us here today. And of course, I will also say thank you to Mikkel and Cecilia for their good questions too. So I wish everybody a very good and safe summer, and we'll put this conversation on YouTube, I think tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed.